time. And we're excited to continue our series with the Certificate of Sephardic Heritage together with Jeannie Milgram and Reconnectar, as hosted by Jewish Unity Through Diversity. So this is our platform, and we're very excited to have today Professor Ronnie Perelis with us, who has not yet been part of this series, although we've had him in the past many times, and he is a wonderful speaker, and we're very excited to have him here today. So before we get started, a few technical things. First, thank you for all those who have supported our programs. We appreciate it. We try to keep the programs open and free to the public, but obviously it still does cost money, so thank you for those who are. This is a two-part series, but two-part session with Professor Perelis, but please do, that's a really hard thing to say, I'm sorry, Professor Perelis. We're going to do Professor Ronnie. But please make sure to sign up for both weeks separately because of the Zoom. It's just makes it easier on us. So please be sure to re-sign up for next week if you haven't yet. And in order to get started, we're moving across the pond now. We've been talking a lot about the Iberian Peninsula, and today we're going to move over west. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Professor Ronnie Perelis is the Chief Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham and Jelena Alcalay Associate Professor of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University and the Director of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs. His research investigates connections between Iberian and Jewish culture during the medieval and early modern periods. His essays on Sephardic history analyze the dynamics of religious transformation within the context of the crypto-Jewish experience. His book, Narratives from the Sephardic Atlantic, Blood and Faith, explores family and identity in the Sephardic Atlantic world. And he may mention that he's working on a new book, but I'm going to let him talk about that. So I'm going to hand the stage over to Professor Perelis. Those who have questions, please put them into the chat and or Q&A. I will be monitoring, and please do continue to tell us where you're signing in from. Professor Perelis.
Thank you very much. Hi, Drora. Drora, it's always a pleasure to work with you and your different projects. You know how to connect so many disparate pieces and bring them together. So it makes a lot of sense that your organization, Unity Through Diversity, you get it. You get how things which don't seem to go together and speak to each other and make each other better. So really, it's been a great working with you for a few years now. It's really been wonderful. So I feel very, very honored and very happy to have you as my friend and my colleague and sometimes partners in crime, good crimes. So thank you. And thank you to all of you making time in your day, whether it's morning for you or afternoon or right now lunchtime, to go deeper and to learn. I see some names that I recognize, some really close to home here. I live in Teaneck, New Jersey also, so I saw a few people. I, as you see I teach at Yeshiva University in New York City. This is my email. Feel free to email me with questions. Yeshiva University is a very unique place. It's a place dedicated to Torah Umada, Torah and the knowledge of the world. It's a Orthodox Jewish university. We educate undergrads and grads, and our grad program, you should know, I'll give a shameless plug. Our grad program, the Revel graduate program in Jewish Studies, is online. We teach synchronous classes, so you have to be able to be on the right time zone. But we teach classes in all fields of Jewish studies, from Bible, Talmud, philosophy, and Jewish history. And so if you're interested in this material, you could definitely look into it. You can look into auditing it as well. So just so you know, there's those of you who are hungry for knowledge. Okay, so lands of captivity and lands of promise. Lands of captivity is one of the ways that conversos who were caught in the world of the Inquisition living under the tyranny and the watchful eye of the Inquisition, living with the rules and the restrictions of what it meant to live in a Catholic Iberian world after 1492. That is often how they referred to where they lived. Sometimes lands of idolatry, sometimes lands of captivity. You see these different terms being used. But what we'll see in the second part of the course is that the Americas proved to also be lands of promise. There are places where there is religious liberty, sometimes great, sometimes more limited, and we will discuss that as well. So we're going to be looking at the two sides of the story where conversos live under the Inquisition in colonial Latin America under Spanish control, and those areas mostly under Dutch and English control, where they were able to be full Jews and live very vibrant Jewish lives. So we'll be looking at both of those. But I'm a teacher and I'm a historian, and I always like to start at the roots. And I know some of you have already heard much of this material, but I think it's always worthwhile to have at least some basic review. And so we'll start really at the source. And by the way, please send in questions. I know that Dror will be looking at the questions being sent into the chat. If there's something really needs to be clarified, I'm happy to stop and clarify it. And obviously at the end we'll definitely leave enough time for questions, okay? That's, it's so important. So the galut livnei Israel asher Knaanim ad Sarfat v'galut Yerushalayim asher bisfarad yarsh et arei hanegev. So even those of you who may not be proficient in Hebrew heard a word there that you recognize, or else you probably wouldn't be coming to this series. The word Sfarad. And you see the translation here. I'm happy that they don't translate the word Sfarad, because the word Sfarad needs, like many things, needs interpretation. The Bible does not come with a map, right? So when it refers to a certain place, unless we know a lot about that place, let's say Mitzrayim, right, the land of Egypt, it's not always clear exactly where that place is. So in this line, this comes from the book of Obadiah, the smallest book in the Hebrew Bible. And in that book, there is vision for the end of days. Now, the end of days are being prophesied after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. And the prophet Obadiah sees the day when the exile come back. But it makes this offhand comment talking about the exiles which have wandered off to this place called Sarfat, and then a particular group of exiles, the Galut Yerushalayim, the exiles of Jerusalem, who are in a place called Sfarad, and that they will come back, and they will come back to the land of Israel, into the Negev, it says here, to the desert, to the south. And we don't know exactly where Sfarad is, according to this. Some historians, archaeologists believe it's a reference to a place in modern-day Turkey, in Asia Minor. But early on in the history of interpretation, the Aramaic translation of Onkelos from the second century of the Common Era, translates Farad as Aspamia. Aspamia, which is a lot like the Latin term for Hispania, land of Spain, which was part of the Roman Empire, and that's why it has a Latin name. And that sticks. Rashi later on quotes it. This becomes the standard understanding of Sfarad as being the land of the peninsula, Spain. And so the Jews of Sfarad, the Sfaradim, are those people who associate themselves with this verse. And so this tells us a lot about, I believe, the identity and the self-perception of Sfaradim. because you have a situation here where they acknowledge that they are a galut, they are exiles, refugees. They are people who don't have a home, or they're not living in their home. And yet there's a flip side of that, which is they are the exiles of Jerusalem, meaning that they are the nobility. They work around the king, or they are the Kohanim, right? They are the priests who work in the temple. And so they are nobles who are in exile. They're not just any old standard people. They are special. They come from a special line, a special lineage. And so there's a deep pride in their origins. But also, if this text is dated to, to the first temple, when a Sephardic Jew living in the 8th century or the 9th century in Spain refers to himself as Sephardi, they're saying that they have been in this land of Sfarad for a very, very long time, that their roots in the land of Sfarad go very, very deep. And this helps explain the pride that Sephardim have in their origins in Spain. This is a pride that they took with them into exile, into the different places they went to, and explains this kind of complex relationship with this land which is so integral to Sephardic identity and culture, but also a land where Sephardic identity and culture was buffeted by violence, by persecution, by oppression. And so we have this very mixed relationship here that I think plays itself out continually throughout Sephardic history in all its different guises. So we have the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is when it's conquered in 711 by the Muslims, it's part of a much larger Islamic world, which has a big influence on the Sephardim. They absorb that Arabic culture, the science and the philosophy, and also the aesthetics. It influences their language. Image from the Alhambra Palace in Granada, one of the great Jewish cities of Spain. It was referred to often as Granat al-Yahud, Granada of the Jews. And Jews were a minority in Spain, but in cities, they were often a large minority, if not a majority, 20%, 30% sometimes in some places. And so you're dealing with a community which is deeply enmeshed in the culture, deeply part of it, isolated in some small corner or in tiny villages of their own. And you see this in their architecture. This is one of the beautiful synagogues that has been restored in Toledo, a Ir ve'em Israel, a great city of Jews in Toledo. You see the Arabic style architecture here that evokes the great Mosque of Cordoba. Here's another great synagogue, in Toledo, where you see the Hebrew writing on the walls, which evokes a style that was very common in mosque, where they would put verses of the Quran as adornment. Here we have verses in Hebrew up above, and as a way of Jews creating this very sacred space that was theirs, that was unique, and at the same time part of the wider culture. Spain was a place of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together, what people like to use the term convivencia. But Spain was also a place of tremendous conflict, of tremendous violence, wars of religion, wars of conquest between the Christians and the Muslims. This is an image of the iconic image of Santiago Matamoros, St. James, the Moor slayer, Matamoros, image of the patron saint of Spain as a warrior defeating the Muslims on the ground here. This was a classic image of the Reconquista. So you have the actual physical violence of the wars between the Muslims and the Christians for territory that coexisted with coexistence. Here you have the tomb of Ferdinand III, who was a great conqueror of Muslim territories in the south. And on his tomb in Seville, on one side, he has Spanish and Latin. On the other side, we have Hebrew and Arabic in his epitaph. So he was a king for all his peoples, really kind of projecting an image of tolerance and of glory in the multiplicity. But again, that coexisted with violence and with war, and he himself was a great warrior. So these are some of the elements that come to really craft and shape Spanish identity in the medieval period, which goes on for a lot longer. Now, along with that sort of physical violence of war, there was also spiritual violence. Starting in particular in the 13th century, we see a turn among many of the different religious orders to try to win over Jewish converts. Muslim converts also, but that had a different valence. And they started studying Talmud, learning Hebrew, trying to better convince the Jews and to argue with them. And so we have the Barcelona disputation, all these sort of events trying to, and there are many others, right, where the Christians are trying to convince the Jews of their error and bring them to Christianity. Now, what starts as very intellectual and about books and ideas, when it mixes over time with political instability, with outbreaks of plague, like the Black Plague coming through, with political civil wars going on in Spain, you get a very different mix. So what starts out as polemics, intellectual ideas and arguments, starts to turn in the hands of ideologues and demagogues, people like Ferran Martínez in Seville, who for years is calling for a much harsher approach to the Jews, that if the Jews are going to see the light, they're going to need to live a much more difficult existence to break them. And he calls for shutting down the 23 synagogues of Seville, or better yet, burning them down. And in a moment of political vacuum in 1391, when the king is a minor, he's about an 11-year-old boy, the Archbishop of Seville dies suddenly, and you have this firebrand, Ferran Martínez, rabble-rousing in the middle of the hot summer, getting people, unleashing violence on the Jews of Seville. This is a great book on the riots that ensue. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend Benji Gempel's book on that violence. Starting 1391, you have these riots that break out in Seville, and they go, if you follow the arrow, basically throughout the peninsula. There's certain areas that they don't go to, certain towns that were not susceptible to this violence, but the aftermath of this violence was about 50% of the Jewish community. And again, remember that, what we talked about at the beginning, communities that were deeply rooted, people who were part of their societies, who spoke the language, were part of the environment that they lived in. They now, about 50% of them either were murdered or converted out of duress, out of fear, out of a desire to save their life. And in some places, the conversion was almost total, like in Majorca, where there was an island, no place to run to. Other places, Jews managed to flee and find safety in a different village, a different town. A different count would take them in. We have a lot of, there are accounts of these riots, of how Jews saved themselves, how Jews succumbed. And in the end, after 1391, you have a Jewish community in Spain, which was large, important, strong, now fractured, where you have people who did not convert, who are Jewish, and then they're often their neighbors, their family members, their brothers, their siblings, their wives, their husbands, who converted. And then what you see afterwards is further rounds of disputations and pressures, the Tortosa and others, which lead to even more rounds of Jews giving up, of joining the church out of all sorts of reasons. I'm not going to get into the reasons, but so we have a fractured community. And not only a fractured community, but a community that is perceived by the Christians, by the non-converso Christians, by those who did not convert, as mixed up. Among the converts, among the conversos, which is the term I'm going to be using mostly here, you have a range. You have people who maybe were not looking to convert, but once the events of 1391 happened, they become actually sincere Christians. They, if not them, then their children within one generation have assimilated, have gone into the priesthood or become nuns, or have become simply devout Christians who've left their Jewishness behind. Others worked very hard to hold on to their Judaism. Some obviously ran away to start new lives as Jews. We have evidence of that, but that was a minority. It was very hard to do such a thing. But so many of them were somewhere in the middle, right? Where maybe they held on to certain Jewish practices, but basically were living Christian lives, all sorts of mixes. And it's very hard to know. It's almost impossible to be able to quantify this. But what we can see is that regardless of what was going on in their heart of hearts, what they believed, and even what they secretly might have practiced, from the outside, the conversos were seen by their now new co-religionists, right? The Christians of their time, they were now seen as hybrids, as not fully Christian, not really Jewish anymore either. And this is kind of embodied by this image that I find so fascinating. This is the image that was on an anonymous pamphlet that was circulated in Spain about 2 generations after the conversions of 1391, in the 1440s or so. This is called the Alboraique. It was a mostly satirical critique of the conversos, but sometimes very, very harsh. And it envisions them, I mean, look here at this image, as a hybrid, is it a horse? No, it's not really a horse. It has these weird legs. It has a strange tail. Even its head is all, it has the ears of a donkey. You're dealing with you're not dealing with something pure. And the reason why so many of their Christian neighbors looked at them differently is that the conversos, socioeconomically, were not that different than they were when they were Jewish. Like I said, regardless of their religious life, whatever they were doing secretly, whatever they were feeling inside, on the outside, they looked very much like they did a generation before. They still worked in the same professions. They often would do business with each other because they were doing business with each other before. Now they're doing business as conversos with other conversos. They marry their children in similar patterns because you don't totally change your life just because you go to church on Sundays instead of going to synagogue on Saturdays. If your business is going to be improved by having your daughter marry the son of your business partner, you're probably going to do that even if the wedding is going to take place in a church. And so things like this, the fact that they lived in the same neighborhoods, the fact that many of them had close relationships with their family members who were still Jewish. We have evidence of converts giving money to the synagogue in honor of their dead parents, right? Their parents pass away and people come and donate shemen lemor, oil for the lamps in the synagogue in honor of their Jewish grandparents, even though they themselves are Catholics now. So things like that, these kind of mixed relationships, to the outside, the what comes to be known as old Christians look at the new Christians, the conversos were called new Christians pejoratively, as not fully Catholic and suspicious. And so the worst part of this for the old Christians was seeing these new Christians, these conversos, not only seem to mock Christianity by basically being Jews who go to church, so to speak, but these people had the gall to take positions of power and glory and honor in society. The structure of Christian tolerance towards Jews, and this was true also for Islamic tolerance towards Jews or other minorities, was a tolerance based on the fact that the Jew would never rise above a Christian. The Jew would always know their place, which was below. The synagogue always had to be lower than the height of the church. A Jew could work in all sorts of careers, but can never have power over a Christian in their job. Couldn't be person have legal power over them or anything else. And so as the conversos, now that they're Christian, they could become priests. They could go into the military. They could marry into nobility. They could become mayors of their towns. And we have this situation in Toledo, 1449, where over a tax dispute, the majority conversos on town council pass a resolution that their old Christian friends don't like, and the old Christians riot against them. They literally attack the conversos, not the Jews of Toledo. They attack the conversos, and then they dissolve the town council and create a new rule, limpieza de sangre, blood purity rules. If you want to have a position of power and honor, you need to show that you don't have any Jewish blood in you, or Muslim blood for that matter. And they created these laws. They were enacted all over the peninsula against the desire of the king and queen and of the church, but they did it anyways. And it created an environment where conversos had to work hard to hide their past, to show that they were good Christians, and that they didn't have that past. And you see this in the fabrication of genealogy books, of people needing to show Libro de Genealogía y Limpieza de Sangre por todas cuatro líneas de Don Antonio Martínez. Right here, you have that. And this comes from 1722. So even in 1722, over 200 years after the expulsion, people in Spain are concerned to show that they are tainted with that blood. Now, I just gave a whole socioeconomic explanation for Jewish difference. I'm sorry, the difference of the conversos. But there was a religious component. Some of that had to do with suspicion that was unfounded, right? There are some very important historians, people like Ben Zion Netanyahu, the father of the prime minister, who was a great scholar at Cornell, and also for Portugal, people like Justonio Saraiva, a really important historian in Portugal, that argued that actually the confessions that were extracted from conversos about their Judaism, their secret Judaizing, was really trumped up, was not based in reality, and that they were punished because of their ethnic origins or their class origins. That is an important school and needs to be read and thought about and considered. However, it seems from the evidence that a minority of the converts, minority of the new Christians, were still attached to Judaism in some form. And in some form is the important part. We rarely talk about a person being fully a secret Jew, as if they keep the entire Shulchan Aruch. It wasn't written yet, but okay, they keep all the halakha, they keep Shabbat, they keep Kashrut, they somehow know the prayers, they keep all the different rules, but they keep it all in secret. And they teach that to their children. That is not what happens. We have no evidence. We have almost no evidence of that. What we do have evidence of is a range of beliefs and practices that seem to have parallels throughout the Iberian world of people who are caught, who are denounced, practicing aspects of Jewish law or belief, anything from saying things like, I believe I will be saved in the law of Moses. Very simple thing to say. Doesn't have a lot of content to it. But that's a pretty radical thing to believe if you're living in a world of Christian dogma. All the way from that to people who worked very hard to never eat meat that wasn't slaughtered properly from a kosher perspective, people who avoided pork products, even in public, people who managed to keep family purity laws, bathing after the menstrual cycles and things of that nature, which was done with tremendous stealth and care and sacrifice. And so you have a range of practices that we find from the inquisitorial trials. This is a painting that you can find in the Prado today in Madrid by Pedro Berreguete of a kind of a fantasized auto de fe, or a procession of faith. Here's Saint Dominic, who died a couple hundred years before, appearing, as he's the founder of the Dominicans, who were mostly in charge of the Inquisition. And so the heretics among the conversos, those conversos who practice Judaism in secret, known as Judaizers, are arrested, are investigated, and eventually are punished, either given penance, like this guy here, who is walking with his sambanito, the tunic which has on it what his crime was, and he can go through a life of penance, work in a hospital or an orphanage or something of that nature for a year, and then be released back to society, all the way to people who will, like these unfortunate souls, who will be burnt at the stake for their sins. And so the Inquisition is set up in 1478 to investigate those Christians who are backsliding towards heresy, but it was really officially and stated as such, the real focus of the Inquisition was not heresy in general, but specifically the converso heresy of Judaizing. So after almost 100 years of the converts in Spain, the authorities, Ferdinand and Isabella, felt that they needed to have an instrument to investigate and punish and reform the converts who were being tempted back from the Christian view, tempted back to Jewish practice. And that was established 1478, first auto de fe 1481 in Seville, where those riots began. The Inquisition started there. After 10 years, there was a sense that the conversos mixing with Jews, with open Jews, with Jews that had synagogues and Batei Midrash and had kosher meat and matzah available and Jewish knowledge and books. The conversos, if they're still living with those open Jews, would continue to backslide, continue to go back to Judaism. And they make the decision after their conquest of Granada. We are back in Granada here in this image. This is the palace of the Alhambra, from which the Catholic monarchs decided to expel the Jews, based on the fact that they felt that the conversos, this is their public defense for their actions. I'm not saying that this is the reason why they did it. This is what they said why they did it. That the Jews who were living among the conversos were a bad influence, and that they needed to be moved away so that the converts could fully assimilate and become good Catholics. And it's from this palace that they write the Edict of Expulsion, which ends over 1,000 years of Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. And this leads to the Sephardic diaspora as we know it, right? Jews going to North Africa, to Italy, to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire. And also the biggest group going to Portugal. Portugal is really important. Portugal was beginning its turn as a world maritime empire. And the Jews who came to Portugal were seen as essential to the success of this global commercial network. The Jews who came went into all areas of finance and commercial actions relating to overseas trade. And they were a small minority, but they were very important for this trade. And this trade was very important for the king of Portugal, who for personal reasons couldn't lose his Jews, but also couldn't have them stay as Jews. And he forcibly converts them. He forcibly converts his Jews, over 100,000 people within a question of a few weeks, are forcibly converted in Portugal. And now, all of a sudden, what took about 100 years in Spain, this process of conversions and mixing and doubt and inquisition, within a few weeks, 100,000 Jews are converted in Portugal. So we have a very strange world now. We have a world of Sephardic Jews who left Spain and founded new communities in the Mediterranean. We have conversos who stay in Spain as Catholics, but who have different levels of Jewish identity, whether it's the negative attitudes of their neighbors, whether it's a strong inner religious life that was secret. And then we have the third category are these people who gave up life in Spain, moved to Portugal, and now are forcibly converted to be Catholics in Portugal, but clearly a day before they were Jewish. So these are very mixed up people. These are people whose allegiances are not clear at all. And this takes us to the Americas, believe it or not, because in the same palace that in 1492, they decide to expel the Jews, they also decide to send Christopher Columbus to India. Now, he goes westward to India. This is a map of the world as was known at the time of Columbus for Europeans. We have Asia, Africa, Europe. After 1492, it takes them a while to realize the reality here. But in the decades after Columbus's first journeys to the Caribbean, we start to realize that the world is not just this, it's also this. And it's really interesting, and it's really has a lot of promise. And the Spanish rush in to conquer, to colonize, to develop. And, with Columbus, very quickly, the Spanish take control of tremendous territory, huge numbers of people, diverse cultures. By 1525, the Spanish have control of Mexico, which was a very advanced, sophisticated society. And you see already at the beginning that Columbus understood that there was a connection between what he was doing and what the crown was doing with the Jews. That the expulsion of the Jews, and the preservation of Spain as a Catholic country was this monumental event. So was his journey to the Americas, and that he hoped that they would appreciate what he was doing. So just a little bit of a overview, just to give a bit of 1391, the riots, birth of the Converso problem or Marianism, different terms. Crypto-Judaism, 1478 establishment of the Inquisition, 1492 the expulsion, but also the discovery. Like I said, by the 1520s, they're in they're in Mexico by the 1530s, 40s, they're in Peru. Their Spanish really expand very quickly. Europeans come, the Spanish come, and they come to the Americas looking for opportunities. The people who are coming to the Americas are looking for opportunities, looking for new ways to make money, to make a name for themselves, to conquer territory. In that mix of people, we have conversos. And the conversos are coming for two reasons, at least. Or I'll say three. First of all, they're coming for the same reason that everyone's coming. Opportunities, money, change of life. But they're also coming because that mentality of limpieza de sangre, of blood purity, that was so widespread, that was so intense in Spain and Portugal, the surveillance and the persecution of the Inquisition, which could arrest someone with very little evidence and destroy their lives. And guess who they arrested with more frequency than others? New Christians, conversos. There was a sense that obviously the rules were the same in the Americas. You couldn't be Jewish in the Americas, but you could escape that old world. You could escape people judging you because maybe your grandfather was Jewish. Escape the arbitrary arrests and persecution of the Inquisition in a place where there were bigger fish to fry, right? You had huge populations of indigenous people that the Spanish were trying to dominate, trying to control and colonize. There were vast expanse of territory where there weren't even Europeans living, where you could live your life. So you had one class of people who were leaving, looking for new opportunities, free of the grasp of the old world, of the Inquisition, and remaking yourself. You can make a new name, you can literally create a new name for yourself. No one knows where you're from. No one remembers who your grandparents were, and you can be a new person. And so they come to the Americas looking for this promise, looking to remake themselves. And in that group of people who are coming, of those conversos, we have examples of communities, whole communities that develop looking to live ostensibly as Spanish Catholics, benefiting from the colonial system, benefiting from the opportunities, but also benefiting from the anonymity and the distance, and hoping to hold on to their Judaism with greater secrecy, with greater security, and they make it to the Americas with that hope. Sadly, as you saw from that timeline, by the 1570s, there is inquisitions established here in Mexico, here in Lima, and then a few decades later in Cartagena de Indias in Colombia, modern-day Colombia on the coast. And this isn't even to talk about Brazil, which is its own very different situation. But the move of conversos from Spain and Portugal to the Americas has this mix of socioeconomic reasons and spiritual reasons. And so that is, I think, really important to understand the basis of why they're coming. They're not coming because they think they're going to be free of any persecution. They understand that this is still Spanish Catholic territory, but the watchful eye is very different. And Drawer's on, so I think there's some questions maybe, and I'll take some questions, and we'll continue to kind of work this out. But I wanted to kind of give you that wider foundational vision.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you. So you might want to turn off the screen.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit because there were
Perfect,
some
great.
questions and some of them went back, but I felt like it wasn't the right place to ask it. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, your quote from
Great.
Obadiah. And the question is, since it's from Obadiah, it's way before Sfarad, which is an interesting question. It's after the destruction of the first temple, not after Islam. Can you put that a little bit in context is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, so the point is, the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, we know that there are Jews in the Iberian Peninsula from evidence, from archaeological evidence, certainly from early Roman times. There are
I'm going to
two,
interrupt you for 1 minute. Sorry.
yeah,
I'm just going to invite you to open your cameras and microphone. Well, not microphones. Open your cameras. So I'm going to invite each of you to come back as a presenter. That doesn't mean we're asking you to present. It just means that we'd love to have you open your cameras so we're not talking to a blank screen. But sorry, Professor Perelis.
sure. So just to clarify that, yeah, I'm sorry if that was there was kind of some telescoping going on. We know that there's evidence of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, certainly from early Roman times, probably earlier with the arrival of Phoenicians and things of that nature. And at that time, Jews in Spain aren't necessarily calling themselves anything, right? They're not calling themselves Sephardim. But by the time that there are Jews in Spain who are calling themselves Sephardim, which is really, you start to see that 9th century Jews in Spain who are living under the Muslims refer to themselves as Sephardim. The hook that they use, the proof text that they're using to explain that is that verse in Obadiah, right? In Obadiah, in the Hebrew Bible, which refers to Sfarad, and Sfarad being understood by early interpreters as Spain or Hispania. So I hope that explains it. I don't know if it did.
I think so. If not, then you'll follow up. There's somewhat of a comment here. Here in Brazil, and you started to talk about Brazil a bit at the end, but here in Brazil, the first Sfardis came from Portugal in 1500. They were conversos in the 1700s, I'm assuming, or 17th century, I don't know. Portuguese from Amsterdam came during the Dutch colonization, but Jews from Portugal during all those centuries settled far from the coast to escape Inquisition. It's said that about 30% of Brazilians in the Northeast have Jewish DNA, and that's always a tricky thing to. So I don't know if you want to respond or don't, but
no, I mean, that was a comment. I didn't see a question there. If there's a question,
no.
I'll respond, but okay. I mean, I'm not, we have a 2-part series, so I'll touch on Brazil. Brazil is it's a little bit of its own reality, but definitely we will talk about it for sure next week. So hold on tight. Yeah.
So now there's a question, was the persecution as severe against Muslims as it was for Jews?
It's a great question. It was different because their presence was different. Muslims, are you talking about from the Inquisition standpoint?
That's what it sounded like, unless
Yeah.
Susanna's with us.
The Jews were about 2% of the population. Muslims, after the conquest of Granada, were about 20% of the population, in some places more. So you're just dealing with a very different numerical reality. And often Muslims and Christians would actually clash militarily because of the number differential and the geography where they were and where they weren't, right? But we have plenty of cases of Moriscos being investigated, some really fascinating ones. But interestingly, the biggest aspect of the persecution of the Moriscos, Morisco means it's like converso for Muslims, was the fact that they were expelled. Despite the fact that they were converted Christians, they were expelled in the late 15th and early 16th century in 2 waves. They were expelled from Spain, and this was a major political event, a lot of controversy. It makes it into Don Quixote. There's a very famous scene with Ricote, his old neighbor. Very moving scene, and talking about the expulsion and the exile of the Moriscos. And so they were, so it's a very different sort of, it's not comparable because it was different. I would say it's different. And you could, look into that. But there's some good stuff on the Moriscos. Also, they were very different. They were rural for the most part, not urban. And so you can kind of do your own thing when you're out there in your own neighborhood. And there aren't, there's no non-Moriscos around. Whereas Jews were very highly urban, and everyone, was in everyone's business in these tiny little medieval towns, right? Yeah.
Renee, you want to ask your question directly?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
Hey.
So how are you? Thank you. Wonderful presentation. So much knowledge. But a lot more than a lot more answered here than my family can even give me sometimes. I mean, because we have Spanish ancestry, my grandmother being French and Spanish, may her memory be for blessing, but so we got lost when, we would just have our traditions that were passed down. And a lot
Mm,
of what you're telling us is giving me some comfort with knowing, okay, this makes a lot of sense why certain documents and when we're trying to find ancestry just stopped, halted, literally, like around her great grandmother or her grandmother's time when they left Spain and even France. So anyway, thank you. So we've got a lot of more work to do, but it's answering a lot of things. But my question was, do you feel is there any discussion among you professionals with uh people, conversos trying to flee Spain and maybe joining Columbus? I mean, I've heard so many different theories about her and Columbus being Jewish and et cetera, but I'm wondering if there's any,
Columbus is
yeah.
Jewish now. Recently there was a DNA. They finally said that he was a Jew.
Okay, so it has been proven. Okay.
No,
No, wait, no,
I
no.
just want to say,
Oh.
I'm very wary of the DNA stuff. I'm going to bring that out, put my cards on the table. I'm not an expert in DNA, but I'm very wary of it. I think it's very dangerous on many levels. We'll talk about it another time. Columbus is a fascinating world figure worthy of study and looking into. His ideas often are nurtured by Jewish ideas that he picked up because he was an omnivore and read a lot of all sorts of strange things, and he picked them up and he used them. And he writes about them. I encourage people to read him. I teach him in my courses. I'm very, I think it's very important. There were conversos on his boat, but because conversos did all sorts of things, you know what I mean? I don't think it's there is this kind of mythological thinking that like, oh, he had a whole plan. He was going to bring. He was a messianic Catholic who had great ideas about himself as being a world important figure, which he became. But no, I mean, look, we know that this is my problem with this. We have so much evidence that so many conversos, and I say conversos because I'm saying it's a range. You have people who couldn't care less about Judaism. In fact, were viciously anti-Jewish. And then you have people like Luis de Carvajal and others who are passionate Jews who are living in this Catholic world and needing to survive. And they all came to the Americas in big numbers. We know this. So why focus on this celebrity, basically, that everyone knows about, that, oh, he was doing, like, you know what? He worked for, he got his contract signed the same place that signed the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews. So, I don't understand. Like, you have plenty real history is much more interesting than these fantasies. That's all. Sorry, I got a little passionate.
No, I know. So I want to make sure that none of the other comments are going to be about Columbus himself. Like Carla said, there definitely is.
And I say, like, read him. He's fascinating.
Right, but there were conversos. I was letting you get to that. There were conversos that sailed with him.
Yeah.
That was what I wanted to make sure that we did.
Not a mystery. It's not like a secret mystery.
Right. So I just want, but we're not talking about Columbus anymore. I just want to put it out there. And then the question is, weren't old Christians also investigated by the Inquisition?
For sure. But they didn't have the assumption of guilt that conversos would have. And in Portugal, this was even more true. The Portuguese Inquisition had presumed guilt much greater if you were of converso origin. But the old Christians, because part of, the foundation of the Inquisition had to do with ostensibly the Jews, right? The Jews who converted. But once that was in place, well, there's Lutherans, and now there's secret Muslims, and now there's witches, and now there's whatever. There was the Alumbrados, which were this kind of amorphous, interesting group of Christians. So it was used as a way to investigate. So of course, we also have, and Miriam Bodian in her book, This is a great book here for Miriam Bodian, great historian. She has two cases of old Christians who embraced Judaism while living, under the Inquisition. I think both of them are priests. Fascinating stuff. Dying the Law of Moses by Miriam Bodian. Really one of the great historians of the Inquisition and the Sephardim. So old Christians sometimes see the light of Judaism and then get caught, if they don't leave early enough in that process. So we have, old Christians definitely. It wasn't.
Can we take Yitzhak and Gerald's questions? Is that
sure?
okay?
I can be here a little bit longer, a little bit. Yes.
Thank you, Yitzhak.
Hi, Yitzhak. Good to see you.
Yeah, I won't
asking
mention
me?
Columbus's name
Okay.
because Drora doesn't want us to talk about
Okay. No, I don't want to do Columbus.
But I think, maybe Ronnie, though, maybe you can comment from your perspective how we can give a little bit of analysis. You had old Christians. Columbus obviously was a very religious figure. Okay, so where and so you take someone like Simon Wiesenthal, who doesn't really understand the material, and he thinks, oh, that's a sign that he's Jewish. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is, in terms of genealogy, I'm convinced that from what we knew, but going back 9 centuries, Columbus wasn't from a Jewish family in Genoa, but he could have been. Okay, in other words, in genealogy, you have many different sides. It's not only one line. Okay, so people don't think in those terms. So societies, much of Italian society also had Jewish roots, even before these expulsions. But what we don't know about, and you touched about, is more the Muslim crypto society. So beside those few cases we know about the Inquisition of the Moriscos in the let's say in the New World, which you're talking about, how do we see their continuity, except in some bizarre cases in New Mexico? But how do we see their continuity? Not
with the
so much in
Moriscos.
Spain, but in Latin America.
Oh, I wasn't saying we don't have that much evidence of Moriscos in Latin America.
No, I know.
Okay. There are cases, and I think it's Barbara Fuchs at Penn wrote about the more from the literary image of it, but like of Moriscos in the Americas. But it's not so much. But in Spain, it comes up in so many different ways. But their religiosity was very different. It was a much more ethnic, and then like I said, they get expelled in 1609. So the ones that stay behind were the more assimilated ones who wouldn't have kept stuff. So it's a very different, and their network is very different. They don't have the same sort of network that Jews developed. There are Grenadine Jews, Grenadine Moriscos in Morocco and things like that, but which is something to study. But yeah.
Since you brought up Morocco, there's a question here. Was there a connection between the Moresques in French and the country of Morocco?
Yes. The term, the reason why in Spain the term for Muslim is Moro has to do with North Africa. Their origin in North Africa, even though a lot of them didn't come from North Africa, right? But that was kind of the original term. Yeah.
And Gerald, you had a question? Or I can ask it if you want. You're on mute. I can ask it.
Were you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have a question and a comment. I'm fascinated by the Columbus being Jewish. I realize the DNA stuff is questionable. I'm involved with the Jewish Study Center, and I'd like to maybe next year have a real study by someone who really knows about DNA to look at what they wrote and stuff. I realize there's a lot of questions, but my question though about the Columbus stuff is what I read a long time ago was that some of the conversos who were on the boat with Columbus were recruited because they were they were knowledgeable about different languages, and they thought that they would be the translators when they went to India. And therefore, when they actually got to the Caribbean, the first people that they let off were the translators, and they may have been conversos. Was anything, do you know anything about that?
So he writes openly. He says openly, he talks about Torres, who was, he says, a converted Jew who spoke Hebrew, Arabic, and Chaldean, right, Aramaic. Now, it's kind of funny. I mean, he's going to China or Japan. Those languages aren't going to be so helpful, except for the point that he doesn't really know where he's going, right? And his knowledge of those places are based on Marco Polo, which is pretty good source, but also some fantastical sources like John de Manville. But I think the one part that's reality there is that knowing Arabic would give you certain baseline of interaction in Muslim-controlled areas like in the Spice Islands and parts of India and things like that. But he's open about it's not. That's what I'm saying. It's not like some secret scheme that he has. He is open that he has this converso on his boat who speaks languages, and he does leave him, and he is part of the group that gets murdered by the locals when they leave them behind. They leave them behind with a certain settlement, and a certain group of indigenous people murder them all when they come back the second time. So that's another thing that I came across in some early writings. I mean, Yitzhak mentioned Simon Wiesenthal. You know, sometimes, look, history isn't owned by anyone. Anyone can go and read and write about it and do it. Like, I have a PhD, fine, who cares, okay? I teach it, that's my job. But anyone can read whatever they want and write whatever they want. But you see, you know, people who are less rigorous, I saw people writing things like, yes, and Torres stayed and he started a community. He was murdered by the time they came back, they were all killed. So unless he magically got away and, you know, met a nice Taino woman and started his own community somewhere in the Caribbean, you know, so these are fantasies sometimes that we kind of project. We want the world to be a certain way. But I think the reality is much more interesting. Like, I really do. If you read Columbus, you will see a lot of, he was very influenced. We know this. He was influenced by Joaquin de Fiore, who was a 13th century Christian mystic from Italy. Joaquin de Fiore was influenced by Abraham Abulafia, the great mystic and philosopher, who had a lot of connections with Christians. And so Columbus reads Fiore, he gets Jewish ideas through Fiore. It doesn't mean that he's Jewish. It doesn't mean that those ideas are Jewish anymore. They've become, you know, filtered, refracted through this very important Christian mystic. And it's about, you know, when he talks about the temple, about getting gold for the temple, it's not going to be a temple that Jews are going to want to go to. Okay, it's going to be a temple to Christ. Okay, on Har HaBayit. So you do with it what you want, but like I'm just a big believer in reading the primary sources. I think they're fast, and you know, we have a lot. He has a lot to look at. Yeah.
But recently, I mean, I don't want to continue about this, but recently, like a month ago, there was a huge thing on Time of Israel and everything.
I know.
Finally,
I know.
It's still
after 22 years of investigation, they finally got to the conclusion that he's Jewish, that he hid,
Right.
but he hid his identity, obviously, Christoph and everything. He totally hid, but all the fact he was not from Italy, all of that was a lie. And I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not source, I don't know if the Time of Israel, but
Right.
no, it's not that the Times of Israel had something. There were papers there was a paper that came out. So I want to make sure that we're not, just because it's a really hot topic, and like Gerald said, maybe it's something to do a whole session.
Sure.
But
Sure.
Yeah.
I would only ask, I mean, because I find it fascinating. Why is it interesting? Because it is interesting.
Why is it interesting that people spend 22 years of their
Yeah,
life?
why? Why does it matter when
It's not interesting to me.
Okay, I want to make sure people can go. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt because I want to tell everybody thank you very much. Some people have been saying they have to leave anyway. So I want to say thank you for coming, and I hope to see you all next week. We will continue to talk, not about Columbus, but we will continue to talk about the New World and the Conversos and possibly even touch upon Thessaloniki in a further one, not next week. That's they wrote in because that's a totally different group of Sephardim there. So
thank you very much.
Sign up.
Thank you, everybody. We'll continue.
And thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dora. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dora.
Pleasure.